This is the Architect Exam Podcast, the official podcast of the Young Architect Academy.
Hey everyone, this is Layla, and welcome to another episode of the Architect Exam Podcast. Today we're going to tackle something that confuses a lot of ARE candidates, which is understanding differences between firewalls, fire barriers, fire partitions, smoke barriers, and smoke partitions. So I know when I took the technical ARE boot camp, this topic consistently came up and was one of the most confusing as we were studying for the exams. And I really get it because all these terms sound very similar, but we really do need to understand that they serve different purposes in building safety. So these 5 separation types might sound similar, but getting them mixed up on the exam or even worse in practice in a real life situation can really have serious consequences. So again, when I was studying, I mixed these up a lot. What's the difference between a fire partition and a fire barrier? Does a smoke barrier need a fire rating? It's really frustrating as you're studying for this. So simplifying topics like this was one of my inspirations to plan and work on creating the Building Codes 101 course on the Young Architect Academy. But today I'm going to give you a helpful overview of these fire separation types and how you can understand the differences between them. So before we dive into the details of each one, let's talk about why these separations really matter and why we need to understand them. They're not just technical terms that I need to memorize for the exam. They're really life-saving systems built into our buildings to provide life safety for people. So when you have a fire that breaks out, these separations give people a lot of precious time to evacuate the building, and it also allows firefighters to respond. And then it limits also property damage by containing fire to specific areas. So for example, if you have a storage space that has over 100 square feet and stores combustible materials, that space has to be rated with a fire separation rating, because if a fire were to break out with all this combustible materials, we don't want it to spread into the entire building. So we want to contain the fire spread as well. So these aren't just lines on construction documents. Think about it as invisible shields that are going to activate exactly when you need them. So now we understand why these matter. Let's take a look at how these systems are organized and the differences between them. Think of them as 5 separation types. They have different levels of security, from a maximum level security to more of a simple level and a least restrictive level. And how do we organize them? So again, they can be very confusing because they sound very similar. And we want to start thinking from the strongest to more robust to the least restrictive. So we start out with firewalls, then it's fire partitions, then smoke barriers, then smoke partitions. And we're going to talk about each one of these now individually and how we can differentiate between them. So the most robust fire-rated assembly would be your firewall. So that's starting in terms of hierarchy from the robust, and then we're going to move on to the least restrictive and the least robust of these. Think about firewalls as basically superheroes of fire protection. So they're so robust that essentially they do separate 2 buildings. So you'll find that between townhouses or separating different parts of large complexes, that's where you would find a firewall. So it literally separates 2 buildings from each other. They have a shared wall that goes from the foundation and actually past the roof by 30 inches to create that separation. And we'll talk about why. So with the characteristics of the firewall, we have to remember that it's going to have the highest fire resistance rating, and that's typically between 2 to 4 hours. It has complete vertical continuity. So as mentioned, the firewall starts from the foundation of the building and goes all the way up continuously past the roof line by 30 inches is the code minimum of that parapet. And the purpose of that is, again, is that fire separation. Let's say if there was a fire in building A that has that shared firewall with building B. Let's say something happened to building A, whether it's a fire or some damage, structural damage. The whole concept of a firewall is if building A were to collapse, building B is going to remain structurally sound. So even though they share a wall, that firewall, they're basically structurally independent, which is the next characteristics that I was going to talk about is we have to remember that firewalls are structurally independent. So they're designed to stand even if the building on one side completely collapses. And I would really encourage you to take a look at firewall. Just search Google Images and you can see examples of that, of just a building completely collapsed, the firewall remains standing, and then the building adjacent to it sharing that firewall remains standing as well. Also, firewalls have the strictest penetration limitations. So you can't just keep running pipes through walls. There needs to be, first of all, we want to reduce the number of penetrations through the wall. And then if we do, we obviously have to fireproof those openings. And then in terms of materials, what do you use for a firewall? Typically, you use non-combustible materials. So you think about concrete or masonry for a firewall. For example, a thick concrete wall extending up beyond the roof. And that's your firewall. And that's how you can distinguish that it's a firewall. It's vertically continuous. So where can you find more information on this in the IBC? If you check section 706, you'll find all the information you need on firewalls. Now, one thing I notice, and it is kind of a common misconception, is thinking that a fire-rated wall is a firewall. So I hear a lot, if we're talking about any fire-rated assembly, oh, this is a firewall, but that's incorrect. So as we just learned, firewalls are to separate two buildings that are sharing that wall from each other, and not every fire-rated assembly is a firewall. So one thing to keep in mind, but just think about it as this great wall of fire protection for the firewall, and it can stand on its own.
You're listening to the Architect Exam Podcast, your guide to passing the ARE.
Hey, I know you're probably cooking dinner or washing dishes right now while trying to remember the differences between firewalls and fire partitions we're covering here, but don't stress about it because after this episode, Layla and I created an excellent reference notes that break down all these fire-rated assemblies into a simple 2-page PDF. Just stop by youngarchitect.com/firewall for your free fire-rated assembly study guide to print for your study sessions. All right, let's get back to this podcast.
Next up would be the fire barriers. So think about it. You were thinking about the firewall as this great wall of protection. Think about fire barriers as basically security fences of fire protection. So these fire barriers are interior walls. They separate fire areas within a building. Where do you see them? Typically around stairwells, elevator shafts, and mechanical shafts. So basically separating also different types of occupancies within a building. Let's take a look at some of the characteristics for a fire barrier. So in terms of fire rating, it does have a significantly high fire resistance rating between 1 to up to 3 hours. So we looked at the firewall, it was 2 to 4. So fire barriers are up there as well, between 1 to 3 hour ratings. So let's talk about also vertical continuity. The fire barriers do need to extend from the floor all the way up to the deck, the structural deck. They're not structurally independent like a firewall, so they don't need to stand if a building collapses. Protected penetrations similar to a firewall. And that's actually comes with a price as well. So fire rated walls or assemblies, they come at a cost because when you're trying to do electrical wiring or HVAC, any penetrations really, they come at a cost. So you want to keep in mind that you only rate walls where you really have to, or where you really are required by code. Again, we mentioned that it also extends all the way up to the structural deck. It doesn't stop at drop ceiling. In terms of materials, similar to a firewall. So you want to use non-combustible materials. but they can be less robust than what we see in firewalls. Where can you look for information on fire barriers? Check IBC section 707 for more information on it. One thing I know that confuses people is that between the understanding of fire barriers and fire partitions. So we'll talk about fire partitions next, but they sound very similar again, but fire barriers are more stringent than fire partitions. So the third type on our list is a step down in protection requirements, which is the fire partitions. Think about it as basically interior fences of fire protection. They're going to be lighter, fire-rated walls. They separate spaces within a building. Just think about corridors, separation between hotel rooms or apartment units. So they're a step down. We've already talked about firewalls, fire barriers, and this is a step down, which is fire partitions. So in terms of fire resistance ratings, typically for a fire partition, you're going to see a 1 hour rating. And you can terminate the fire partition up to the ceiling. So again, we're starting to go from the most stringent to the least stringent. So a fire partition, when you think about corridors, that wall doesn't have to go all the way up to the deck. So from the floor to the ceiling and to the fire rated ceiling. Again, it's less stringent requirements than the previous two that we've talked about. So you still need protected openings. So any fire rated wall, you're going to need to rate the doors, windows, really anything that will be within that assembly. Generally, they do go up to the ceiling. They don't have to go all the way up to the structural deck. And then in terms of materials that you can use, again, this is a step down. We can use combustible materials like wood. So you can see fire partitions that are made of wood material. If you want more information on fire partitions, I would recommend checking IBC section 708 for that information. So one of the biggest mistakes I've seen, and I've confused that myself, is between fire barriers and fire partitions. So just remember that partitions, think corridors. They're like partition between two spaces. It's definitely less restrictive than the barrier. Now we're going to move from fire-focused assemblies to those that really emphasize smoke control. So we're shifting gears to smoke barriers. So think about it as smoke dams of a building. So the walls are going to be specifically designed really to block smoke movement. Where do you typically see smoke barriers? In hospitals, and hence they create smoke compartments. So this is more of a horizontal movement within a floor plate from one smoke compartment to the next. So what does that mean? Let's say I have a hospital and there's like surgery area, there's a pre-op, post-op area. Depending on the size of this floor plate, we'd want to designate smoke compartments, meaning let's say, I have smoke compartment A that's separated from smoke compartment B with a smoke barrier, meaning that if, let's say, there was a fire or something that happened in smoke compartment A, people can run out and rush into smoke compartment B to safety and then safely exit the building. So it gives people a way out to move from the area wherever the fire happened and then or smoke or whatever that is to another compartment that's going to be safe, that's not going to have the smoke and that's not going to have a fire and will help them evacuate. In large hospitals, you can have a number of smoke compartments within the hospital. And in the IBC, there is a maximum square footage for a smoke compartment that you can look up in the IBC. So there's requirements for smoke compartments, but we have to remember that the smoke compartments are separated by smoke barriers. So what are some of the key characteristics for these smoke barriers? Typically, even though it says in its title, smoke barrier, typically it's a 1 hour rated wall and it has to be continuous through concealed spaces. There's focus both on smoke containment and fire resistance. So from its name, it's a smoke barrier, but also it has another element to it, which is fire resistance of having that 1 hour fire rating. And as I mentioned, just remember that smoke barriers, you can create smoke compartments, and typically where you see this is in hospital settings. Where can you find this in the IBC? Check section 709 for more information on smoke barriers. One common misconception that I see that people think that a smoke barrier doesn't have a fire rating, but it really does. So just because it says smoke barrier doesn't mean it's automatically just for smoke. So smoke barrier is both a smoke barrier for smoke and containing smoke and for also containing fire with a 1 hour. And now we're at the fifth type. It's the least protected from the 5 assemblies that we just talked about. It is the smoke partition. So think about it as just like a screen door of fire protection. What we need to know about a smoke partition is it's just going to slow down the spread of smoke. So they're not fire rated. They're primarily used to contain smoke and prevent smoke spreading or to slow down the spreading of smoke. So where can I find a smoke partition? You can find it in elevator lobbies. You can also use it in corridors if you have fully sprinklered buildings. We just have to remember the difference between a smoke partition and a smoke barrier. Smoke partition is not rated. It typically is not rated. It's going to be less stringent continuity requirements than a smoke barrier. You can terminate at a ceiling instead of going all the way up to the deck. And it does focus solely on limiting smoke transfer. So you just want to picture corridor walls with doors that automatically close when the fire alarm activates to keep the smoke from spreading. And then smoke partitions are covered in the IBC section 710. What's a common misconception in terms of smoke partitions is that we assume that they provide significant fire protection when they're really just designed to limit the smoke movement. So smoke partitions are not rated assemblies. They're just really used to limit the spread of smoke.
You're listening to the Architect Exam Podcast, the official podcast of the Young Architect Academy.
Okay, so now we've covered each one of these types individually. Let's start comparing all 5 together side by side to start understanding the differences between them that we just talked about. First, let's talk about the fire resistance rating. So we talked about that firewalls have the highest fire resistance rating, and it's between 2 to 4 hours. Then comes fire barriers, which we have between 1 to 3 hours. What follows a fire barrier? Fire partition, and that's going to be typically a 1 hour rated wall. Then we have smoke barriers, and which are typically 1 hour rated. And then the last one, which is smoke partitions, and that is typically not a rated assembly. So in terms of continuity requirements, so they range from the most stringent, where we talked about the firewall goes from the foundation of the building all the way up past the roof. And then we have basically the smoke partition that can just go from floor to ceiling, and that's it. So why are doors and windows rated at less than the assembly they're in? Is because doors are smaller and they're less likely to be point where a fire is going to spread. And they also need to be operable, which makes them difficult to insulate to the same level as the walls. Let's take a look at where you'll typically find each type of these walls in different buildings, because typically where these systems are used can really help you understand the concepts better. So let's start with healthcare facilities. So we have smoke barriers are critical for creating areas where patients can be moved horizontally. This is when we're creating smoke compartments within a building. And if you look at your Code Illustrated book, it does show that smoke barriers typically are used in healthcare facilities. Fire barriers, they surround exit stairs and shafts, and fire partitions can separate patient rooms. If we look at let's say multifamily housing. So we look at fire partitions that are going to separate the individual dwelling units. We also have fire barriers that are going to surround the exit stairs, similar to what we see in healthcare facilities as well. Firewalls can also be used to separate connected buildings or townhouses. In, let's say, commercial buildings, we can use fire partitions, which often separate tenant spaces. Fire barriers are also used similarly, just like in hospital setting or in the multifamily housing example. Fire barriers are used to surround exit stairs and also your elevator shafts or mechanical shafts. They can also be used to separate mixed occupancies as well. In commercial settings or commercial buildings, you can use smoke partitions that might be used also in elevator lobbies. I know I threw a lot of information at you, so I want to give you some simple ways to just remember the differences between these fire-rated assemblies. So let's start with firewalls. They're going to divide buildings. Think of fire barriers that are going to divide areas. Then we have fire partitions. Think about them as dividing spaces. And then smoke barriers, they're going to block the smoke. They're going to also have fire resistance. And then smoke partitions, they're just going to delay the smoke. So think of it as a progression from the exterior to the interior of the building, and obviously from the most restrictive, most robust to the least restrictive or the least protective. Okay, so we covered a lot of information today. I hope this does clear up some of the confusion around these 5 types of fire separation. And then just remember, they're not technical terms that we use. It's not something that, we need to memorize for the exam. We need to understand what these systems are, how they're used, and the differences between them, because what we want to use them in our own practice to protect people's lives and protect property from damage during a fire. So if you do find this helpful, I want you to check out my Building Codes 101 course that you can find on the Young Architect Academy, where I do go into more depth on these separation systems. And there's also 180 questions that tackle some of this information. There's 175 flashcards for you to study, basically from, they range from difficulty from easy, intermediate to difficult. And I hope that kind of builds on the information that I provided you today. I did create the course specifically to help you understand all these complicated code concepts. Once you really start, doing practice questions, understanding the content and the concepts behind them, they really become much easier to understand and remember for the exam. And remember, it's not just for your exam, it's for your own practice and to your due diligence towards life safety on projects. So I do want you to take a takeaway is next time you go into a hospital or if you go into an IT closet, take a look at some of these fire rated assemblies that we talked about. Try to distinguish the differences between them, or think about, I wonder what this fire rated assembly is. I think maybe it's this, and research it. I think hands-on experience too helps a lot to just identify which separation types you're using.
Thanks for listening to the Architect Exam Podcast. Ready to take your studying to the next level? Visit our online ARE Architecture School website at academy.youngarchitect.com to learn more about how we can help you. See you next time.